The flashing lights pierced the darkness as Officer Johnson pulled over the sleek black sedan. It was a routine traffic stop, or so he thought. Little did he know this encounter would turn his world upside down and expose deep-rooted issues plaguing his precinct. "License and registration, ma'am," Johnson said, shining his flashlight into the car. The beam illuminated a well-dressed black woman in her mid-40s. She seemed oddly calm, almost amused. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady and authoritative. Johnson's partner, Officer Williams, hung back, eyeing the situation warily. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "You are going 10 over the limit," Johnson replied curtly. "I'm going to need to see some ID." The woman nodded, reaching slowly for her purse. "Of course, I apologize for the speed. I'm actually running late for an important meeting." As she handed over her license, Johnson's eyes widened. He blinked hard, sure he must be seeing things. The name on the ID was familiar, too familiar. His stomach dropped as realization dawned. "Everything all right?" the woman asked, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. Johnson cleared his throat, suddenly feeling very small. "Ah, yes, ma'am. Chief. I didn't realize." The woman he pulled over was none other than Samantha Brooks, the precinct's newly appointed police chief. The same chief both officers were scheduled to meet for the first time tomorrow morning. Chief Brooks stepped out of the car, her presence commanding even in the dim streetlight. "At ease, officers. I think we all have a lot to discuss." As she spoke, more patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing. Word travels fast in a small town. Soon, a small crowd of officers had gathered, murmuring in confusion and disbelief. Johnson and Williams exchanged panicked glances. How could they have made such a colossal mistake? And what would this mean for their careers, for the entire precinct? Chief Brooks surveyed the growing crowd, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said finally, "it seems our first meeting is happening a bit earlier than planned. Shall we get started?" The tension in the air was palpable as she gestured for the officers to gather around. This late-night traffic stop was about to become a turning point for the entire police force, one that would expose uncomfortable truths and force everyone to confront their own biases. As Chief Brooks began to speak, her words cut through the night air, sharp and clear. This was more than just a case of mistaken identity. It was a wake-up call, a chance for real change. And whether the officers were ready or not, that change was coming. The story of what happened next would send shockwaves through the community, sparking difficult conversations and pushing for long-overdue reforms. But in that moment, under the harsh glare of patrol car headlights, no one could have predicted just how far-reaching the consequences of this traffic stop would be. Chief Brooks leaned against her car, her eyes scanning the faces of the officers gathered around her. The night air crackled with tension as she let the silence stretch, each second feeling like an eternity to the anxious cops. "I had hoped," she began, her voice low but carrying easily in the quiet street, "that our first meeting would be under different circumstances. But perhaps this is exactly what we needed." Officer Johnson shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her gaze. He'd been on the force for 15 years and had never felt so out of his depth. Beside him, Williams stared at his shoes, his face a mixture of shame and confusion. "Let's be clear," Chief Brooks continued. "What happened tonight isn't just about me. It's about every person of color who's been pulled over for no good reason. It's about the assumptions we make and the biases we carry, often without even realizing it." A murmur rippled through the group of officers. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked defensive, arms crossed tightly over their chests. "But I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame," the chief said, holding up a hand to quiet the crowd. "I'm here to make changes. Real, lasting changes that will benefit not just our department, but our entire community." As she spoke, a car slowed nearby, the driver craning their neck to see what was happening. Word was spreading fast, and curious onlookers were starting to gather at the edges of the scene. Chief Brooks noticed the growing crowd and made a decision. "Let's take this conversation somewhere more private. I want all of you, every officer here, to meet me at the station in 1 hour. It's time we had an honest discussion about where we go from here." With that, she got back into her car and drove off, leaving behind a group of stunned officers and a swirl of unanswered questions. Back at the station, the atmosphere was electric. Officers huddled in small groups, whispering theories and concerns. Johnson and Williams sat apart from the others, both lost in their own thoughts. "What do you think is going to happen?" Williams finally asked, breaking the tense silence between them. Johnson shook his head. "I don't know, man, but I got a feeling things are about to change around here. Big time." As if on cue, the door swung open and Chief Brooks strode in. The room fell silent instantly, all eyes following her as she made her way to the front. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice firm but not unkind. "I know this isn't how any of us expected to spend our evening, but I believe what happened tonight has given us a unique opportunity." She paused, making eye contact with each officer in turn. "An opportunity to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we do our jobs and who we serve." Over the next hour, Chief Brooks laid out her vision for the precinct. She spoke of community outreach programs, implicit bias training, and a complete overhaul of the department's approach to traffic stops and other routine interactions. Some officers nodded along enthusiastically, while others shifted uneasily in their seats. Change was never easy, especially in a profession steeped in tradition and routine. As the meeting drew to a close, Chief Brooks addressed the elephant in the room. "I know some of you are wondering about Officers Johnson and Williams," she said, gesturing to where they sat. "Rest assured, this incident will be thoroughly reviewed. But I want to make something clear. This isn't about punishing individuals. It's about recognizing a systemic problem and working together to fix it." Johnson felt a weight lift from his shoulders, even as a new sense of responsibility settled in its place. He glanced at Williams and saw his own mix of relief and determination mirrored in his partner's face. As the officers filed out of the room, the air buzzed with a strange mix of apprehension and hope. They all knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like real change might be possible. Outside the station, a small crowd had gathered. Word of the late-night meeting had spread, and community members were eager for answers. Among them was Maria Rodriguez, a local activist who had long pushed for police reform. "Chief Brooks," Maria called out as the officers began to leave. "Can you tell us what's going on? Is this about the traffic stop earlier?" The chief paused, considering her words carefully. She knew that how she handled this moment could set the tone for her entire tenure. "Ms. Rodriguez," she began, "and everyone else who's come out tonight, thank you for your concern and your engagement. Yes, there was an incident earlier this evening that brought some important issues to light. I want you all to know that we're taking this very seriously." She went on to outline some of the changes she proposed, emphasizing the department's commitment to transparency and community partnership. As Chief Brooks spoke, a mix of emotions played across the faces in the crowd. There was skepticism from some, hope from others, and a general sense that something significant was happening. Maria listened intently, her expression guarded but curious. When the chief finished, she stepped forward. "This all sounds good, Chief Brooks, but we've heard promises before. How can we trust that this time will be different?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of past disappointments and broken trust. Chief Brooks took a deep breath, knowing her answer could make or break this crucial moment. "You're right to be skeptical, Ms. Rodriguez," she said, her voice steady and sincere. "Trust has to be earned, and we have a lot of work to do. But I'm asking for a chance, not just for me, but for every officer who's committed to doing better. Give us the opportunity to show you, through our actions, that we're serious about change." As she finished speaking, a hush fell over the crowd. The next few moments would be critical in shaping the future of police-community relations in their town. But what happened next would surprise everyone involved, setting in motion a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, community, and the true meaning of serving and protecting. The days following Chief Brooks' impromptu meeting were a whirlwind of activity. The precinct buzzed with a mix of excitement and apprehension as new policies were rolled out and old habits were challenged. Officer Johnson found himself at the center of it all, grappling with his role in the incident that had sparked this change. One afternoon, as Johnson was leaving the station, he overheard a heated conversation between two of his colleagues. "This is ridiculous," Officer Mike Hansen was saying, his face flushed with anger. "We're cops, not social workers. All this sensitivity training is just going to make our jobs harder." Maybe that's not such a bad thing, replied Sarah Chen, a younger officer who had been vocal in her support of the chief's reforms. If it means we're doing our jobs better, more fairly. Johnson hesitated, torn between walking away and joining the discussion. Before he could decide, Hanson spotted him. What do you think, Johnson? You're the one who started all this. Feeling all eyes on him, Johnson took a deep breath. I think, he said slowly, that we owe it to ourselves and our community to at least try. If there's a chance we can do better, shouldn't we take it? Hanson scoffed and walked away, but Chen gave Johnson an approving nod. As he headed to his car, Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that the precinct was dividing into two camps, those embracing change and those resisting it. Meanwhile, across town, Maria Rodriguez was organizing a community meeting to discuss the recent events. The local community center was packed, with people spilling out onto the sidewalk. We've heard promises before, Maria addressed the crowd, her voice passionate, but this time feels different. Chief Brooks seems genuinely committed to change. The question is, are we ready to meet her halfway? The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, some expressing hope, others skepticism. In the back, a man named Derek Thompson stood up. Derek had lost his son to police violence 2 years ago, and his pain was still raw. How can we trust them? He asked, his voice trembling with emotion. After everything that's happened, how can we believe anything will really change? A hush fell over the room as people turned to look at Derek. His question hung in the air, heavy with years of distrust and heartache. Maria took a moment before responding. I understand your pain, Derek. We've all been hurt, disappointed, and let down. But if we don't take this chance, if we don't at least try to work with them, then nothing will ever change. We have to be brave enough to hope. As the meeting continued, opinions were divided. Some, like Derek, couldn't bring themselves to trust the police again. Others saw Chief Brooks' actions as a glimmer of hope in a long, dark struggle. Back at the precinct, Chief Brooks was facing challenges of her own. She sat in her office, reviewing complaint files from the past year. The stack was dishearteningly thick. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Captain Rodriguez, no relation to Maria, a veteran officer who had initially seemed supportive of her reforms. Chief, we need to talk, he said, his face grim. Some of the officers are talking about filing a formal complaint. They say your new policies are making it impossible for them to do their jobs effectively. Chief Brooks leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of resistance pushing against her. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Captain. Can you tell me more about their specific concerns? As Captain Rodriguez outlined the officers' grievances, Chief Brooks listened carefully. She knew that for her reforms to succeed, she needed buy-in from her team. But she also knew she couldn't back down from what she believed was right. I hear their concerns, she said finally, and I want to address them, but I also need everyone to understand that going back to business as usual is not an option. We have to find a way forward that works for everyone, our officers and our community. Captain Rodriguez nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. As he left her office, Chief Brooks turned to look out the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city she had sworn to protect and serve. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. Changing an entire system, especially one as entrenched as law enforcement, was never easy. But as she watched the city lights flicker on, she felt a renewed sense of determination. Across town, Officer Johnson was just finishing up his shift. As he walked to his car, he spotted a familiar face, Derek Thompson, the man from the community meeting. Derek was arguing with another officer, his voice rising in frustration. Johnson hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. He walked over, his heart pounding. Is everything okay here? He asked, looking between Derek and his colleague. The situation was tense, balanced on a knife's edge. Johnson knew that what happened next could either reinforce old wounds or begin to heal them. As he stood there, under the harsh glare of the parking lot lights, he realized that this moment was what all of Chief Brooks' reforms had been leading to. This was where change really happened, not in meetings or training sessions, but here on the streets, in these small, crucial interactions between officers and the community they served. As Johnson took a deep breath and prepared to navigate this delicate situation, he couldn't help but wonder, could they really bridge the gap between the police and the community, or were the wounds too deep, the mistrust too ingrained? The answer to that question would shake not just the future of their precinct, but the very fabric of their community. And as the night deepened around them, that answer hung in the balance, waiting to be discovered. Officer Johnson approached Derek and his colleague, Officer Ramirez, with caution. The tension in the air was palpable, like a rubber band stretched to its limit. "What seems to be the problem here?" Johnson asked, keeping his voice calm and neutral. Derek turned to him, eyes blazing with a mix of anger and pain. "Your buddy here thinks I look suspicious just for walking down the street. Same old story, different day." Officer Ramirez bristled. "Sir, I was simply asking." "It's okay, Ramirez," Johnson interrupted softly. "I got this." He turned to Derek. "Mr. Thompson, right? We met at the community meeting. Can we talk for a moment?" Derek hesitated, eyeing Johnson warily. Finally, he nodded. As Ramirez stepped away, Johnson and Derek moved to a quieter spot. "I remember your story, Mr. Thompson," Johnson began. "About your son. I can't imagine how painful that must be." Derek's face softened slightly, surprise flickering in his eyes. You remembered?" Johnson nodded. "I did. And I want you to know that's why I'm here. Why I'm trying to change. We all are." As they talked, neither man noticed the small crowd gathering nearby. Among them was Maria Rodriguez, who had been walking home from a late meeting. She watched the interaction with keen interest, her phone discreetly recording the scene. Across town, Chief Brooks was working late, poring over the latest community feedback reports. Her phone buzzed with a text from Captain Rodriguez. "Turn on the news. Now." With a sense of dread, she flipped on the small TV in her office. Breaking news headlines flashed across the screen. "Protest turns violent outside police station." Chief Brooks felt her heart sink as she watched footage of angry protesters clashing with officers in riot gear. How had things escalated so quickly? She grabbed her keys and rushed out, her mind racing. As she drove towards the station, she couldn't help but wonder if her reforms had somehow made things worse. Had she pushed too hard, too fast? Meanwhile, the situation outside the station was reaching a boiling point. The crowd had swelled, with both protesters and counter-protesters facing off. Officers formed a line, trying to keep the peace, but tensions were running high. In the midst of the chaos, Officer Williams spotted a familiar face, his partner, Johnson, making his way through the crowd with Derek Thompson. What were they doing here? As Johnson and Derek approached the police line, a hush fell over the nearest protesters. Someone recognized Derek, and his story began to spread through the crowd in urgent whispers. Chief Brooks arrived on the scene, her heart pounding as she took in the volatile situation. She spotted Johnson and Derek and made her way towards them, sensing that whatever happened next would be crucial. Just then, a bottle flew through the air, shattering at the feet of the officers. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Officers reached for their gear, protesters braced themselves, and the air crackled with the potential for violence. In that split second, Chief Brooks knew she had a choice to make, one that could either salvage everything she worked for or watch it all crumble to dust. She locked eyes with Johnson, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, placing herself between the officers and the protesters. "Everyone, please," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "I know you're angry. I know you're frustrated, but this isn't the way." The crowd quieted, all eyes turning to the chief. Derek stepped forward, standing beside her. The sight of them together, the black police chief and the man who had lost his son to police violence, was powerful. "We have a chance here," Chief Brooks continued, her voice steady despite the tension. "A chance to do something different, to break the cycle of mistrust and violence, but we can only do it together." As she spoke, Maria pushed her way to the front, her phone still recording. This was a moment that needed to be captured, a turning point in their community's history. The crowd hung on Chief Brooks' every word, the anger in the air slowly giving way to a tentative hope. But the peace was fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. In the back of the crowd, Officer Hanson watched with a scowl. He'd had enough of this new way of doing things. It was time, he decided, to take matters into his own hands. As Hanson began to move forward, his hand reaching for his weapon, Johnson spotted him. In that moment, Johnson realized that everything, the reforms, the community's trust, possibly even lives, hung in the balance. What happened next would determine not just the fate of their precinct, but the future of police-community relations in their town. As the tension reached its peak, everyone held their breath, waiting to see how this powder keg would ignite. Johnson's heart raced as he saw Hansen's hand move towards his weapon. In a split second, he made a decision that would change everything. He lunged forward, shouting, "Hansen, no!" The crowd, already on edge, reacted instantly to Johnson's sudden movement. Panic spread like wildfire, and people began to push and shove in their rush to get away. Chief Brooks, caught off guard, stumbled backwards. In the chaos, Derek Thompson found himself face to face with Hansen, their eyes locked, years of pain and mistrust crackling between them. For a moment, it seemed as if all the progress they'd made was about to unravel. But then, something unexpected happened. Maria Rodriguez, still recording on her phone, stepped between them. "Wait," she shouted, her voice somehow cutting through the noise. "Everyone, look." She held up her phone, and on the screen was a live stream of what had just transpired between Johnson and Derek earlier that evening. Their conversation, filled with honesty and compassion, played out for all to see. The crowd fell silent, transfixed by the image of a police officer and a grieving father finding common ground. It was a powerful reminder of the humanity on both sides of the divide. As the video played, Chief Brooks seized the moment. "This is what we're fighting for," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Not just policies and procedures, but real understanding between people." The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious hope. Even Hansen lowered his hand, the fight seeming to drain out of him as he watched the video. But just as it seemed the crisis had been averted, a new complication arose. A group of masked individuals, taking advantage of the distraction, began smashing windows and setting fires to nearby buildings. Suddenly, the police were faced with a difficult choice: maintain their peaceful stance or take action to protect property and potentially reignite tensions with the crowd. Chief Brooks knew that her next decision would be crucial. She looked at Johnson, then at Derek and Maria, silently asking for their trust. Then she turned to address her officers. "We will protect our community," she said firmly, "but we will do it the right way. No excessive force, no racial profiling. We prove right here, right now, that we can uphold the law and respect our citizens at the same time." As the officers moved to confront the vandals, something remarkable happened. Members of the crowd, including Derek and Maria, stepped up to help. They formed a human chain, preventing the masked troublemakers from causing more damage. It was a powerful image. Police and protesters working side by side to protect their community. News cameras captured the scene, broadcasting it live across the city and beyond. But even as this unexpected alliance formed, a new threat loomed on the horizon. Word came through that a group of hardline officers from neighboring precincts were on their way, determined to restore order their way. Chief Brooks realized that the real test was yet to come. Could the fragile peace they'd established withstand this new challenge? Would the community and the reforming officers stand together against the old guard? As sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the approach of the hardline officers, Chief Brooks knew she had precious little time to prepare. She gathered Johnson, Derek, Maria, and a few key officers around her. "What happens next will define us," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Are we ready to stand for what we believe in, no matter the cost?" The small group exchanged glances, each person weighing the gravity of the moment. They all knew that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of their community, but potentially set a precedent for police reform across the nation. As the sirens grew louder, tension mounted once again. The crowd, sensing the approaching conflict, grew restless. Chief Brooks took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. In that moment, with the world watching and the future hanging in the balance, she made a decision that would shock everyone, supporters and critics alike. It was a gamble, one that could either cement the changes they'd fought for or destroy everything they'd built. As she stepped forward to address the crowd one last time, the air crackled with anticipation. Whatever she was about to say, everyone knew it would be a turning point in this unfolding drama. The question was, would it lead to triumph or tragedy? Chief Brooks stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong. I'm ordering all officers to stand down and remove their riot gear. Right now." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even her supporters looked shocked. Was she really asking officers to make themselves vulnerable in the face of potential violence? As the sirens of the approaching hardline officers grew louder, Brooks' own team hesitated. She locked eyes with Johnson, silently pleading for his trust. After a moment's hesitation, he began to remove his gear. One by one, other officers followed suit. Derek Thompson watched in disbelief. He'd spent years distrusting the police, but seeing them willingly disarm themselves in a gesture of peace, it stirred something in him. Just then, the convoy of hardline officers arrived, sirens blaring and lights flashing. They poured out of their vehicles, fully geared up and ready for a fight. Their leader, a grizzled captain named Harris, strode towards Chief Brooks. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "Gear up. We're taking control of this situation." Brooks stood her ground. "No, Captain. We're handling this our way, peacefully." Harris sneered. Your way is weak. It's time for real police work." The tension was palpable. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would the hardliners force their way in? Would the fragile peace shatter? Suddenly, Derek Thompson's voice cut through the silence. "Wait." All eyes turned to him as he walked towards the two chiefs. "I want to say something." Derek took a deep breath, his voice shaking slightly as he began to speak. 2 years ago, I lost my son to police violence. I've hated and distrusted the police ever since. But tonight I've seen something different. I've seen officers willing to listen, to change, to put themselves at risk for the sake of peace." He turned to face the crowd. "If they're willing to take a chance on us, shouldn't we be willing to take a chance on them?" A murmur ran through the gathering. Maria stepped forward, her phone still recording. "He's right. We've all seen what happened here tonight. This could be a new beginning, but only if we choose to make it one." Captain Harris scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously be buying this kumbaya nonsense." But to everyone's surprise, some of Harris's own officers began to remove their riot gear. They'd been watching the live stream, seeing the events unfold in real time. The power of the moment was undeniable. Seeing the tide turning, Harris made a last-ditch effort. He reached for his weapon, but before he could draw it, he found himself surrounded, not just by Brooks officers, but by members of the community as well. "It's over, Harris," Brooks said quietly. "The old way is over." As Harris was led away, a cheer went up from the crowd. It wasn't just a victory for Chief Brooks or her reforms. It was a victory for the entire community, a step towards healing deep-rooted wounds. In the days that followed, the story of that night spread far and wide. News outlets picked up Maria's live stream, and soon the whole country was talking about the precinct that had chosen peace over force, understanding over confrontation. But just as it seemed like a fairy tale ending, a new challenge emerged. As Chief Brooks and her team began to implement their reforms department-wide, they faced resistance from unexpected quarters. Some community members, long accustomed to adversarial relationships with police, struggled to accept the changes. And within the force, old habits died hard. 1 month after that fateful night, Chief Brooks called a meeting with Johnson, Derek, Maria, and other key figures from both the police force and the community. As they gathered in her office, she looked at each of them in turn. "We've made a good start," she said. "But the real work begins now. Are you ready?" As they nodded their agreement, a sense of determination filled the room. They all knew that lasting change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and unwavering commitment from everyone involved. But as they left the office that day, stepping out into the bright sunlight, there was a feeling of hope in the air. For the first time in a long while, it felt like real change was possible. And it had all started with a routine traffic stop and a chief who refused to back down. The story of Chief Brooks and her precinct would go on to inspire similar movements across the country, proving that with courage, compassion, and a willingness to listen, even the deepest divides could be bridged. It wasn't the end of their journey, far from it, but it was a powerful new beginning, one that would reshape the future of policing and community relations for years to come. In the months that followed, Chief Brooks' precinct became a model for police reform across the country. The changes weren't always easy, but the foundation of trust they built that night proved strong enough to weather the challenges. Officer Johnson found himself at the forefront of these changes. He led training sessions on de-escalation techniques and community engagement, sharing his own journey from skepticism to belief in the new approach. His partnership with Derek Thompson grew stronger, and together they spoke at schools and community centers, sharing their story of finding common ground. Maria Rodriguez's role evolved too. Her live stream had catapulted her into the spotlight, and she used her newfound platform to bridge the gap between the police and the community. She started a popular podcast called Behind the Badge and Beyond, where officers and community members shared their experiences and perspectives. As for Derek, the pain of losing his son would never fully heal, but he found a new purpose in working towards change. He became a vocal advocate for police reform, testifying before the city council and state legislature. His powerful personal story helped sway even the most hardened critics. Chief Brooks faced her share of obstacles. Some officers resigned, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new way of doing things. But for every officer who left, there were 2 new recruits eager to join a department that was making a real difference. The community's response was mixed at first. Years of distrust couldn't be erased overnight, but as people saw the changes in action, officers engaging respectfully with residents, community policing initiatives taking root, a sharp decline in use of force incidents, attitudes began to shift. 1 year after that pivotal night, the precinct held an open house. The turnout was overwhelming. Residents who had once crossed the street to avoid officers now chatted with them over coffee and donuts. Kids who had grown up fearing the police played basketball with off-duty officers in the parking lot. As Chief Brooks surveyed the scene, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Captain Harris, the hardline officer who had tried to shut down their peaceful approach that night. "Chief," he said, his voice gruff but sincere, "I owe you an apology. I didn't believe this could work. But seeing this," he gestured at the diverse crowd mingling peacefully, "well, I was wrong, and I'm glad I was." Brooks smiled, extending her hand. "It's never too late to be part of the change, Captain. Welcome aboard." The precinct's success didn't go unnoticed. Other departments began sending officers to observe and learn. News outlets ran features on the Brooks model of policing. Even Hollywood came calling, with talks of a movie based on the events of that night. But for those who had been there, the real story wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the small, daily victories. Like the day Johnson responded to a call about a young black man acting suspiciously in a park, only to discover it was a college student birdwatching. Instead of a confrontation, it ended with Johnson borrowing the student's binoculars to get a better look at a rare warbler. Or the time Derek, still grappling with his loss, found himself comforting a rookie officer who had frozen during a tense situation. "It's okay to be scared," Derek had told him. "What matters is what you do with that fear." As the second anniversary of the Night of Change approached, the precinct planned a community celebration. They closed off several blocks for a street fair, with food trucks, live music, and activities for kids. Officers mingled with residents, out of uniform, just neighbors enjoying a beautiful day together. Chief Brooks took the stage to give a short speech. As she looked out at the crowd, officers and civilians, young and old, a rainbow of faces all turned towards her, she felt a lump in her throat. 2 years ago, she began, we stood on these very streets, divided and afraid. Today, we stand together, not as perfect people in a perfect system, but as a community committed to doing better, to being better, every single day. She paused, her eyes finding familiar faces in the crowd. Johnson, standing tall and proud. Derek, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Maria, her ever-present phone capturing the moment for posterity. The work isn't done, Brooks continued. We still have a long way to go, but look how far we've come. This is what's possible when we choose understanding over fear, when we see each other as human beings first. As she finished speaking, a spontaneous applause broke out, spreading through the crowd like a wave. It wasn't just clapping. People were hugging, shaking hands, patting each other on the back. The sound of it echoed off the buildings, a physical manifestation of the bonds that had been forged. Later that evening, as the sun set and the fair wound down, Chief Brooks found herself sitting on a park bench with Johnson, Derek, and Maria. They watched as the last of the families headed home, officers and volunteers working together to clean up. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" Maria asked, looking around at the peaceful scene. Derek shook his head, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Honestly, no. There were times I thought it was hopeless." He paused, then added softly, "I wish my son could have seen this." Johnson reached out, placing a hand on Derek's shoulder. No words were needed. The gesture said it all. Chief Brooks leaned back, taking it all in. "We've made progress," she said. "But this isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning." As if on cue, a radio crackled to life. A domestic disturbance call, just a few blocks away. Brooks stood, straightening her uniform. "Judy calls," she said with a smile. "Who's coming with me?" Without hesitation, they'd all stood. Officer and civilian, each ready in their own way to continue the work they'd started. As they walked towards the patrol car, the last rays of sunlight caught the badge on Brooks' chest, making it gleam. But it wasn't the badge that truly shone. It was the spirit of a community united, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead together. The story of Chief Brooks and her precinct would be told for years to come, a beacon of hope in troubled times. But for those who lived it, the real story was in the daily acts of courage, compassion, and understanding that had transformed not just a police department, but an entire community. As night fell and the stars came out, the city settled into a peaceful quiet. But in homes and hearts across the community, a new day was already dawning. A day full of possibility, of second chances, and of the enduring power of human connection.